The late autumn air in the Bighorn foothills of Wyoming carried a sharp, metallic tang, the unmistakable scent of impending snow and deep, biting cold, a promise of a truly brutal winter. This chill wasn't just atmospheric, it was a psychological element that had settled deep into the bones of the old ranch house, seeping into the soul of Carl Harding. Carl, a man of 60, whose hands were permanently warped by decades of fence mending, hay hauling, and wrangling cattle, felt utterly adrift. He was a creature of routine and hard, tangible work. He knew how to fight blizzards, how to nurse a sick calf, how to repair a tractor engine with sheer willpower and wire. But grief was a formless enemy, a fog that smothered effort and made the simplest task, like brewing a cup of coffee or remembering to shave, feel like scaling a mountain. From his kitchen window, glazed with condensation that he habitually wiped away with the back of his hand, he watched him. This window was a sacred space. Here, he and Elara had spent 40 years greeting the day, his mug chipped and functional, hers a delicate blue china cup, now preserved under a glass dome on the mantel, untouched. Now, his view was dominated by the horse, Shadow. Shadow was a majestic, 16-hand, black as midnight quarter horse, normally a vision of power and grace. Now, he stood utterly immobile in the far corner of the largest paddock, 100 yards from the house. His posture was one of profound apathy, head hung low, mane matted, his once gleaming coat dull and dusty. Carl could make out the sharp ridges of his ribs beneath the hide like painful, accusing ripples, a sign of the horse's neglect and his refusal to properly eat. The entire ranch, the sagging 3-rail paddock fence, the weeds choking the water trough with slick algae, the peeling crimson paint on the barn door, mirrored the state of Carl's heart. Everything was decaying, slowly but surely. To Carl, the horse was the living monument to his pain. He was the 4-legged secret his wife had kept, the embodiment of a suspicion that had poisoned their final year together. Their life had been built on a foundation of shared labor and unspoken understanding. Yet, in that last year, a chasm had opened, deep and cold. Shadow was the cause. Carl was sure of it. He remembered the increasingly frequent late afternoons Elara would spend in the barn, the hushed phone calls she would take, her quick silence when he walked in, and the tired, evasive answers she gave when he asked what she was doing. Carl, a proud man unaccustomed to expressing deep vulnerability, had convinced himself that Elara was having an emotional, or worse, a physical affair, that she was choosing to invest her time and love into this other life, and the horse was the physical link to that secret world. Carl would replay their last conversation in his mind, the bitterness sharp and clear. "What is it, Elara? What are you hiding in that barn? I'm right here," he'd pleaded, his voice rough. Elara had just turned away, a look of profound sorrow, mixed with something like resolve, on her face. "I'm just busy, Carl. I have a big project I need to finish." He felt the sting of that abandonment again now. Elara, his gentle wife, known for her quiet grace and her connection to the land, had poured her final, waning strength into this horse, this project. For what? Carl bitterly concluded. To leave him alone, with a failing ranch, another enormous mouth to feed that he could barely afford, and a painful, breathing reminder of his failure as a husband. The sheer loneliness was often so crushing that Carl would stand in the empty living room and simply yell at the ceiling, demanding an answer that would never come. The fragile solitude was shattered by the grinding sound of heavy tires on the frozen gravel. Dale Vance, a neighbor known for his pragmatic kindness and his steady demeanor, stepped out of his battered Ford F-150. Dale, a link to the past, a man who still treated Carl as a competent partner, not a walking ghost. "Carl," Dale nodded, his eyes narrowed as he assessed the paddock. "Any change in him?" Carl approached the fence, the cold wood rough under his palms. "He won't let me near. Stays back there. He's wasting away. I've called Henderson. Carl stated the buyer's name like a final verdict. He's a hard man, knows horses. He'll give a fair price. It's the kindest thing, really, for both of us. Maybe, Dale said softly, his breath misting in the cold air. I heard that grief's a funny thing in an animal. They can't process it. It just paralyzes them. Carl didn't respond. He didn't want to talk about grief. He wanted finality. An hour later, the arrival of the sleek, intimidating black truck belonging to Mr. Henderson was a jarring intrusion. Henderson, cold and businesslike, strode directly into the paddock, a stiff new leather halter in hand, the brass fittings glinting aggressively. The moment Henderson's highly polished boots hit the dusty ground, Shadow transformed. The lethargic, broken posture vanished. His head snapped up, nostrils flaring as if catching the primal scent of a predator. His powerful shoulders tensed, and his ears flattened against his skull. A low, powerful sound, a guttural warning more fitting for a caged wolf than a horse, rumbled deep in his chest. Henderson, seeing only an unruly asset, tried to corner the horse against the fence, but Shadow was terrifyingly fast and agile, kicking up clouds of dust. His movements were sharp, defensive, and filled with a desperate, concentrated energy. He wasn't scared. He was a fortress of fury defending an invisible line. After a tense 10-minute standoff that left Henderson sweating and cursing, the buyer threw the halter to the ground in disgust. "Waste of my time, Dale. That horse ain't grief-soured. He's mean and dangerous. You'd be lucky to get meat price for him at auction." The words, meat price and auction, struck Carl with the force of a physical blow. The sudden, sharp nausea pulled him back from the fog of his own anger and self-pity. He saw, clear as the mountain air, the brutal reality, the chaos of the sales floor, the kill pens, the terrifying last ride. Elara, his gentle, compassionate Elara, who treated every animal as a sacred trust, would have sooner cut off her own hand. The sheer horror of that ultimate betrayal, sending Elara's last project to such a terrifying end, was the first authentic feeling that wasn't just bitter resentment. It was a cold, moral certainty. After Henderson and Dale left, the sun began to bleed out behind the mountains, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and burnt orange. The wind picked up, whispering through the dry, frozen grass, a lonely sound. Carl stood alone at the fence, the silence profound. Shadow had retreated to his corner, but he was watching Carl now, his dark eyes intelligent, holding a question, even an accusation. For the first time in 6 months, Carl looked past the symbol of his pain and saw the creature beneath, a magnificent animal, just as lost and abandoned, and just as furious at the world as he felt. "What am I going to do with you?" Carl whispered into the wind, his voice rough and scratchy. He knew he couldn't send him to auction. The letters from the bank were growing more urgent, the financial burden a terrifying weight. But this was a moral line Carl Harding could not cross. It would be the final, unforgivable betrayal of the woman he had loved. "One more week," Carl declared, his voice firm, a powerful promise to the horse, to Elara's memory, and to the rancher he used to be. "I'll give you 1 more week." This reluctant decision, made in the lonely twilight, set in motion a chain of events that would force Carl to confront not only his loss, but the devastating possibility that his entire perception of Elara's final, distant months had been tragically wrong. The horse didn't just hold his wife's secrets. He held the key to the last, unspoken chapter of their love story. The week Carl gave Shadow began with the establishment of a fragile truce. Carl had one simple, pragmatic goal: to restore the horse's health so he could be sold into decent hands, avoiding the humiliating and cruel auction block. His first task was physical recovery. He cleaned the manger of old rotten hay, manually scrubbed the slimy algae from the water trough, and filled it with fresh well water. He brought down the choice flakes of sweet alfalfa, the fragrant kind Elara always insisted on for her horses, even during the toughest financial years. However, Physical healing was only half the battle. The real fight was for contact. Carl's first attempt to approach with the currycomb was met with familiar hostility. As soon as Carl entered the paddock, Shadow's body language clearly screamed, "Stay away!" Frustrated, Carl threw the comb down and, overwhelmed by anger and exhaustion, leaned against the decaying fence. "You're just like her. You know that?" The words burst from Carl in a bitter, uncontrollable torrent, as if a dam holding 6 months of pain had finally broken. "I thought you were the reason I wasn't needed anymore. I hated that she came out here to you instead of talking to me." He vented all his hurtful suspicions, his deep shame, and his jealousy toward this silent, proud animal. "I hate that I had to lose her twice, first to her silence, and then forever." A ragged, ugly sound, the first pure cry Carl had allowed in half a year, tore from his chest. In that moment, something extraordinary happened. Shadow's ears, which had been pinned back aggressively, slowly swiveled forward, tuning only into Carl's voice. He took a hesitant step toward the old man, then another. Shadow stopped a few feet away, his great head slightly cocked, showing not malice, but deep, focused attention. When Carl finished, his body shaking with silent despair, he felt it, a gentle, warm pressure against his shoulder. He looked up, his eyes blurred with tears, to see Shadow standing right beside him, his muzzle resting softly against Carl's heavy plaid jacket. The horse let out a long, shuddering sigh, a breath that seemed to carry the weight of his own profound sorrow. In that moment, Shadow was no longer the symbol of betrayal to Carl. He was a fellow mourner. Carl slowly raised a trembling, calloused hand and laid it on the animal's powerful neck. Shadow did not flinch. He leaned into the touch. The thawing had begun. In the days that followed, this truce deepened. Carl began grooming Shadow, brushing away 6 months of dust and grime, and the horse stood still, sometimes even relaxing his lips. As he brushed, Carl told Shadow stories about Elara, funny, tender, sometimes bitter, and Shadow listened, his eyes often closed. One afternoon, gathering his courage, Carl forced himself into the sanctuary he had avoided the longest, Elara's small workshop attached to the back of the barn. It smelled intensely of wood, beeswax, and his wife's unique, earthy perfume. While sorting through an old leather satchel hanging on a peg, his fingers brushed against something hard and unfamiliar, tucked into the deepest hidden pocket. He pulled out a worn, handmade leather case, the size of a small map book. The case was empty, but its surface was covered in complex, almost invisible tooled lines. They were not decorative. Carl, the old rancher, instantly recognized them as topographical contours, but for terrain entirely unfamiliar to him. None of the local mountains matched the pattern, a mystery without a key. The next day, while Carl was currying Shadow, the low afternoon sun suddenly highlighted something on the lower parts of the horse's legs. Carl paused, running his hand over the skin. These were not the clean, straight cuts of barbed wire. These were tangled, overlapping, silvery old scars, a chaotic web. The scars spoke volumes. This horse had repeatedly scrambled through dense undergrowth, snagged on branches, and struggled over sharp, loose rock. These were the scars of a horse that had repeatedly navigated dangerous, high-country, off-trail terrain. The cryptic map case and the unusual scars. They did not align with the image of the Elara he thought he knew, the woman who always took the easy, scenic creek trail. In Carl, for the first time in months, something other than grief or anger began to sprout. Pure, urgent curiosity. By the end of the week, Shadow was transformed. His coat had a hint of its old sheen, his eyes were clear, and he would nicker softly in greeting. Carl knew he should call the buyer, but the thought now brought a sharp, physical protest. He couldn't. "One last ride," Carl murmured, saddling Shadow with Elara's gear. "We'll take Elara's favorite creek trail, a final goodbye for both of us." They set out. When they reached the familiar fork in the trail, Shadow abruptly froze. To the left lay the easy, well-worn path to the creek. To the right, the path quickly vanished into a steep, rocky incline leading high into the mountains. Elara never went right. No one did. Carl tried to urge Shadow left, but the horse planted his feet. His refusal was absolute. He took a decisive, non-negotiable step toward the mountain ascent. A strange chill ran down Carl's spine. The map case, the scars, an impossible thought began to form. This horse knew something. He was trying to show him. Carl looked up at the rugged, unforgiving peaks, then down at the powerful, steady animal. He was weary of fighting. He let the reins go slack in his hands. "Okay, Elara," he whispered into the empty air. He leaned forward and patted Shadow's neck. "Okay, Shadow, show me." It was not a gesture of defeat, but the first act of faith the old rancher had made since his wife died. Shadow immediately turned onto the path Carl had never known and began the long, determined climb home. The journey up the mountain was a crucible. The barely there trail quickly vanished entirely, forcing Shadow to pick his way through dense, thorny thickets of aspen and over fields of loose, sharp shale. Carl, a good flatland rider but no mountaineer, clung to the saddle horn, trusting the animal he had despised just days ago with his very life. This was not a ride. It was a desperate, trusting pilgrimage. The landscape grew wilder, more remote, and incredibly silent with every upward step. But Shadow moved with an absolute, frightening confidence. This was not an exploration for him. It was a routine. Carl realized with a profound, sinking sense of shock that Elara had not been riding the gentle creek trail all those months. She had been coming here with Shadow. The horse was her partner, her silent accomplice, hauling unknown cargo up this treacherous route. The entire last year of Carl's resentment and suspicion evaporated, replaced by a cold terror mixed with soaring hope. Just as true dusk began to settle, painting the sky in deep, bruised shades of indigo and violet, Shadow broke through a final dense stand of pine trees and into a high, hidden meadow. Carl gasped, momentarily forgetting the cold. Nestled in the center of the clearing, perfectly sheltered by a ring of ancient firs and protected from the whipping mountain winds, was a small, perfectly crafted log cabin. It looked like it had grown naturally from the earth. It was Elara's handiwork, unmistakable in the precise, tight joinery of the logs and the elegant, simple lines of the roof. It was a place Carl had never known existed. With trembling legs, Carl slid from the saddle. Shadow nudged him gently toward the heavy wooden door. Carl pushed it open. The inside was a single, immaculate room, filled with the unmistakable, comforting scent of beeswax and his wife. A simple cot was neatly made with a handmade quilt. A small pot-bellied stove stood cold in the corner, and on a sturdy, hand-carved table in the center sat a wooden box. Carl's heart hammered against his ribs. He walked toward the table, his movements heavy and slow. He lifted the lid. Inside, resting on a folded wool blanket, was a thick stack of letters tied with a piece of faded leather twine. All of them were addressed in Elara's familiar, strong script to Carl. He sank onto the nearby chair, fumbling with the twine. The emotional validation was a sudden, violent wave, washing away months of poisonous anger and misunderstanding in an instant. The first letter, dated nearly a year ago, explained everything. "My dearest Carl," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and my best boy, Shadow, has finally brought you to our place." She wrote that she had been diagnosed with a severe, aggressive form of cardiomyopathy. The doctors gave her a year, maybe less. She confessed that she couldn't bear to tell him. She didn't want their last months to be spent watching his face fill with fear, nor did she want him to become her nurse instead of her husband. She chose to protect him by withdrawing. Her project was this cabin. She used her remaining precious time and strength to build him a final gift, a sanctuary for him to find after she was gone. Shadow was bought specifically as her partner. The horse was strong, incredibly smart, and quiet, the perfect accomplice. Together they had hauled heavy lumber, bags of cement, and tools up the treacherous mountain path week after week. Shadow had been her legs when her own strength failed, and her constant, silent support. The horse had kept her secret, bearing the weight of her devastating loyalty. Tears streamed down Carl's weathered face, blurring the careful script. He read about her fears, her overwhelming love for him, and her deep regret for the emotional distance she had deliberately created to spare him further pain. The last letter was the shortest, dated just a few days before her heart had quietly given out. The cabin is finished now. My heart is too. It's funny, the doctors gave me a year, and I used almost exactly that much time to finish my last project. I'm tired, Carl, but I am not afraid. I have left you a lifetime of love within these walls. If you are reading this, it means Shadow brought you here. I told him to. When he knew you were ready, he would show you the way. Trust him. He was more than my horse. He's the keeper of my heart. My last goodbye is this new beginning for you. I love you always, Elara. Carl dropped the letters, his body consumed by sobs, not of anger, but of a grief so pure and profound it was almost beautiful. He stumbled outside. Shadow was waiting patiently, his head low, his dark eyes soft. Carl threw his arms around the horse's thick, warm neck, burying his face in the coarse mane. "I'm so sorry," Carl choked out. "I'm so sorry for hating you. You knew all along. She told you to take care of me." The horse simply stood, a solid, warm presence in the cold mountain air, and leaned his weight into Carl's embrace. Shadow had brought him home. Weeks turned into a long, brutal Wyoming winter, blanketing the mountains in a profound and cleansing silence. Carl did not sell the ranch. He did not sell Shadow. They became an inseparable pair, finding a shared solace in the vast, quiet landscape. The cabin became Carl's sanctuary, the place where he finally began to heal. 2 years later, the sign at the end of their long gravel driveway read, "The Harding Legacy Retreat." Carl established a non-profit foundation that offered equine-assisted therapy for grieving spouses and families. Using the ranch and the remote, quiet cabin, it became a place for people shattered by loss to find their own path home. At the heart of it all was Shadow. The once sullen, misunderstood horse became the program's gentle, intuitive soul. He stood patiently for those consumed by sorrow, offering his quiet strength as a balm. Carl, the old rancher who once stood at that paddock fence looking at a horse with hatred, now watched Shadow graze peacefully, his heart filled with a love so expansive it had room for his past, his present, and a future filled with hope. Proving that sometimes the most profound love stories are not about letting go, but about being led to a new beginning. If this powerful story moved you, subscribe to our channel and hit that notification bell so you never miss another inspiring tale of courage, hope, and the extraordinary bonds between humans and animals. Share this video with a friend who would love this story.